Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Seth Klein. Seth is the team lead and director of strategy with the Climate Emergency Unit. Prior to that, he served for 22 years as the founding director of the British Columbia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Canada's foremost social justice think tank. Seth is now a freelance policy consultant, speaker, researcher, and writer, and the author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth, it's a pleasure having you here on Decouple. Thanks for making the time.
Hey, Chris. Good to be with you.
So, Seth, I didn't warn you of this, but I do like to ambush my guests with a self-introduction. I know a little bit about you. The son of draft dodgers, a peace activist in the 80s, and now you're writing a book, which is a call to action modeling climate response on a wartime mobilization. So, in a personal way that helps our listeners get to know you, help us understand that journey.
Yeah. If you had asked any of my teenage friends if I was going to write a war story, they'd be mightily surprised.
Right.
It was in the peace and disarmament movement before the end of the Cold War, in that I was a kid in the nuclear era.
Right.
And that was our emergency. Yeah. And I cut my political teeth in the peace movement. And I am as you quickly alluded to there, I am the child of war resistors. Mm-hmm. So I certainly didn't intend to write a war story. 2.5 years ago, I left the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, wanting to devote more time to the climate emergency and wanting to tackle this gap between what the science says we have to do and its urgency and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And but originally, when I wrote my first book outline, there was only going to be a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War, right? Because I'd long been intrigued by that example. So many of us have this question in the back of our minds: can we really do this at the speed and scale required in the short window we have left? And to my mind, I thought, hey, this is kind of an interesting story. It's sort of like, yeah, well, maybe we can, because we sort of did. But the more I delved into that, the more I saw more and more parallels, not just on the economic front, and good story and narrative. It was also jolting my own thinking about emergency. Mm-hmm. Like I've dealt with the climate file for well over a dozen years, but it was making me look at it with fresh eyes. Right. And I ended up restructuring the whole book around lessons from the Second World War, much to my surprise.
So, obviously, like any analogy has its limits and contradictions, and maybe we'll get to some of those for now, but
and there are those for sure.
Absolutely. But, let's just take a moment, step back, and fill us in on what we did accomplish. I think Canada punched well above its weight in terms of its contribution to the World War II war effort and the Allies. So maybe just walk us through a few of the most interesting elements of that, and we can dissect them a little bit.
So my book deals much more with what happened on the home front than on the battlefront. Yeah. And I do think that's the more interesting story. So first of all, when war originally broke out in late 1939, Canada, still very closely tied to Britain, declared war shortly after Britain. For the next 2 years, Canada was pretty much the only country in the Western Hemisphere engaged in the war. Mm-hmm. We were less than a third the size of what we are today by population. We were a small country of about 11 million people. Out of that 1 million people, just to give you a flavor for the scope of mobilization, over 1 million Canadians enlisted, and over 1 million Canadians were directly employed in military production. We went from an industrial base of almost nothing, like Canada produced effectively nothing with respect to military hardware.
Like we were just kind of a natural resource exporter to the mother country, and she'd send us back So this was our industrialization.
We had 2 tanks, Chris.
Right.
We entered World War II with 2 tanks. We were producing a few dozen airplanes a year. During the Depression, the shipbuilding industry had basically gone completely dormant. You had a few shipyards doing repairs. Mm-hmm. In those 6 years of the war, Canada produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 16,000 aircraft, building what was then the 4th largest air force in the world at the time. over 700 ships, and these are big ships, merchant marine cargo ships, as well as warships,
Right.
all in the space of 6 years. And it was a true society-wide mobilization extraordinary. So, it's interesting you asked the question you did, because when you engage Canadians on climate, the question that almost invariably comes up is, well, we're so little, even if we did everything right, what would it matter? But the thing is, we were even smaller then. And at the end of it, nobody questioned the value of our contributions.
Yeah. The kind of byline of the podcast is, end the politics to make it possible. I think there's some pretty big, I think there's a few similarities and differences. I mean, we're sort of entering a new gilded age to a degree with especially the wealth transfers that have occurred under COVID to the billionaire class.
Which incidentally was illegal in the war.
Exactly.
That kind of profiteering was illegal in the war.
Right. So, I mean, we can talk about COVID as another, potential analogy for this response, but we're sort of in a neoliberal paradigm, which has reduced the role of the state to almost nothing. I mean, I was talking with a US thinker, and he was telling me that at the onset of World War II, I mean, the federal government hadn't arrived at what it became after the New Deal. And apparently Roosevelt, they needed to commandeer, I'm going to get this wrong, Al Capone's car, armored car, to get him to make the war declaration. So, there's maybe an analogy that both governments were not sort of, had not reached and taken such a large role in the economy. But there's certainly differences. And I think kind of labor militancy is a big difference. The Bolshevik Revolution had happened. Capital was kind of a bit afraid. So I'm just, in terms of the state taking, and this, I think, if we're looking at this World War II metaphor, I mean, the state takes a really major role in this.
That's right.
The politics are a bit different, or are there some similarities in terms of
there are
COVID
similarities.
Response?
Yeah, there are. I think often, when I would present this thesis I was playing around with to people would say, oh, well, but back then people had greater faith in a state and more social solidarity and, just more cohesiveness. None of that's true. In fact, in Canada, when you measure inequality measured by the share of income going to the wealthiest 1%, over the last 100 years, the year of maximum inequality in Canada was 1938, the year before the war. Right. We did not go into this fight a cohesive society. That was forged in the doing. You had a business class, as you were just alluding to, that was not at all keen about entering into this fight in either Canada or the United States. The threat was not clear and present. It was on the other side of two oceans. The business class in both countries had a fresh memory still of World War I. They did not like the level of state interference in their affairs in World War I. They did not relish it happening again in World War II. And so, particularly now that my book was all written before the pandemic, but it came out in the pandemic, and I've spent a bunch of time thinking about these parallels that, whether it's the war or COVID, climate, other emergencies, all emergencies start with a period of denial, both with leadership and the general public. And then some alchemy has to happen, some combination of events and leadership that shift the popular zeitgeist and bring us into emergency mode. That had to happen in the war. We all experienced it 16, 15 months ago at the outset of this pandemic. And that process is moving in slower motion with respect to climate, but it is happening. And I would say in many respects, the public is ahead of our politics when it comes to climate. But, in the United States, it took 2 years for US public opinion to shift 20 percentage points before Pearl Harbor around opposition to entry of the war into support for entry into the war.
I mean, I think it's interesting because, war itself as a motivator for collective responses or for cooperation, it's as old as human history. And the climate response is one that requires sort of unprecedented cooperation, at least, I think the kind of response that we think of, an expansive response that's progressive, that, includes everybody. When in many, I was looking at a paper recently that was looking at kind of wargaming of climate responses, and the response ended up often being very focused on adaptation, fortress Europe, fortress America, the keeping refugees out, like a lot of elements that did happen in World War II as well.
Yes,
but
that's right.
It can get pretty dark. So how do you frame those motivations? Like, to me, in a way, it seems kind of naive, because and that's why I think climate change is such a wicked problem. To all sort of collaborate. It's unprecedented. It's slow motion. Do you think that this war analogy can hold water when talking just about motivations and sort of getting us there and getting us cooperating on a global effort rather than sort of great power as in competition?
Chris, my sense of it, and I'm a political scientist, not a historian, but the thing about all of these crossroads moments is they can always go either way. Mm-hmm. The Great Depression gave rise to both Nazism and the promise of the New Deal. Mm-hmm. And that's why, in the book, I'm particularly interested in the question of leadership and the right people in the right place, mm-hmm. the right time, who can take the jumble of confusing and contradictory values that live in all of us, mm-hmm. and either animate the ugly stuff or animate the best stuff. And both are always happening in the face of every crisis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the unlikely heroes of your book, as I guess a progressive, is this figure C.D. Howe, who was kind of on the right wing of the Liberal Party. I think he was one of these $1-a-year men. I think that's another thing. He
was the recruiter of the $1-a-year men.
Okay, but
he was in cabinet. He was
right. Yeah. And this idea of, just how impoverished the public service tends to be because of the sort of opportunities, wages, sort of creativity that's possible, I think, within a kind of startup entrepreneur world. Like, I have a friend who's involved in healthcare informatics, right? And, working within government is very stifling and boring, and working, doing his own startup is super exciting. And I think, like, how do you attract those brightest minds to and really kind of technocrats to lead this response in this neoliberal context? I don't know if there's a great answer for that, but I thought I would pose it to you as a mini question.
Your question is one that I became quite fascinated in the writing of the book. First of all, I became completely fascinated by this guy you mentioned, C.D. Howe. Mm-hmm. And he's not a natural person for whom I would have affinity. I mean, as you say, he was no lefty. He was on the right wing of the Mackenzie King cabinet. But he was intriguing because, first of all, along the lines of what you're saying, he wasn't a career politician. He wasn't a lawyer like most politicians of that day. He was an engineer. Mm-hmm. He was a builder. So while he was, right-leaning and he'd made a lot of money in the private sector before going into politics, he was one of these guys. He was interested in technology, and he was an innovator, and he was in a hurry. Once he got the emergency, he just wanted to get stuff done as fast as possible. Happy to give contracts to the private sector, but if the private sector couldn't quickly do what he needed doing, he created a new crown corporation in Canada, what we call public enterprises, mm-hmm. to get the job done. He created 28 of these during the war. And to your point, he was forever frustrated with the slow pace of the public service. So he starts running the public service. He recruits over 100 of these $1-a-year men to drive the change. He was frustrated with the lawyers in government who are always telling you what you're not allowed to do. So what does he do? He creates his own legal department in the Department of Munitions and Supply, with 3 shifts of lawyers, including a night shift of lawyers, to expedite. Like, that's what emergency meant to him.
Sounds like the emergency department right now.
Yeah, right. But it's interesting that there's one of my mentors is this guy, Alex Himmelfarb, who used to be the clerk of the Privy Council, the head of the public service in Canada. And his critique of my early draft of the book was, C.D. Howe did something extraordinary, but running the public service isn't the answer, because then you lose some checks and balances, you get some graft. Mm-hmm, the point is to transform the public service. Mm-hmm. Fire those who cannot move into emergency mode. Bring in the innovators who want to meet the moment with you. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need to do today. And by the way, to your first question, Alex's great line to me was, he's also looking at the legacy of neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. And his point is, the most insidious legacy of that 40 years of neoliberalism isn't just the spending cuts and the diminished state capacity and so on. It's the sapping of our imagination and our faith in our collective capacity to do grand things together. And that's the historic story I'm trying to excavate for this moment.
So I think I want to move on to a few sort of contradictions, which I think are interesting to me. One is you're describing CD Howe, you're describing this, highly technocratic response. And when we look at the climate movement, there's certainly a lot of, kind of this idea of energy democracy, decentralization. I have to face it, there's a lot of NIMBYism, right? What's being discussed in terms of a number of climate responses is unprecedented in terms of really a reindustrialization, massive infrastructure build. Fossil fuels are a very energy dense source. And in a sense, many suggestions are moving down the energy density ladder, which requires, more infrastructure, et cetera, transmission lines. There's also, a strong sort of degrowth tenet, I think, within the climate movement. And that really seems to, again, stand in stark contradiction to a war level mobilization, particularly a reindustrialization, because you're arguing, that we can or should do this in Canada. We need to build these industries, whatever it is, if we're banging out wind turbines or whatever. Currently, the majority of the world's steel is made in China on a very coal heavy grid. The majority of the world's polysilicon is also made in like Xinjiang, China, with, again, a 90% coal grid and potentially forced labor. So there's a lot of contradictions here. But I guess that question of, the need for a technocracy versus an energy democracy in times of emergency. What is your thinking on that?
Oh, I really wrestled with those tensions in the writing of the book. And I do land in a place that probably causes some discomfort for some of my friends, because what I am ultimately arguing is that, and this may not have been true 20 years ago if we had started to move when we should have, but given how short the window is now, I am arguing that to achieve the speed and scale required, it has to be state-led.
Yeah.
And that any idea that we will achieve what we need to achieve by kind of liberating communities and the private sector and the nonprofit sector to voluntarily do what needs doing, we're fried. We don't have the time.
Yeah.
So we both need the state-led level for speed and scale, and I do feel like we have to do more of it ourselves, each of us in our respective countries. But we also need to do it differently than we did back in the war story that I am recounting. It has to be more democratic. And so I'm also drawn to ideas like Extinction Rebellion, saying that, while the speed and scale of what we have to do shouldn't be up for debate, the question of how we can achieve it should result from a citizens' assembly process or something like that. So we try to democratize some of the decision making.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely going to be numerous examples, right, of people, even environmentalists, fighting, renewable energy installations or transmission lines, which are, depending on the energy path you choose, very, very important for a transition. So I guess that's my question for you is, does that need to be addressed within the climate change movement? Do we need to push back against degrowthers, for instance? Because again, like this climate response is not occurring under a degrowth framework. Basically, like when you look at sort of a transition from gas and oil to, batteries and renewables, it's a shift to minerals and mining. And, experts are saying that this will lead to the greatest increase in mining in world history, which environmentalists largely oppose mining. So how do you deal with those sort of conflicts within the environmental movement? Because that might be the greatest barrier in a sense. I mean, let's not minimize but a large barrier, a significant barrier.
I don't think it will be the greatest barrier. It will be a barrier, but I don't think it'll be the largest barrier. I think in the main, environmentalists get what's going to be required to decarbonize. And I think there's, a solid body of evidence that while the environmental impact of that kind of mining is significant, particularly if we do it right and thoughtfully, it doesn't hold a candle to the kind of environmental impact of failing to meet the climate emergency. Let me put aside the degrowth question for a second. I think you're right to name this NIMBY reaction, and it manifests in different ways. Like it also manifests just at the level of urban planning and the fact that we need to densify how we live and organize our communities. And then you get a kind of NIMBY reaction from sort of older green voters who just like things the way they are, you know? Mm-hmm. So what am I saying? Here's where I take some solace from the war story. People's response once you get an emergency often defied predictions of how people would respond. What I'm arguing is that these are the markers of when we approach something with an emergency mindset. We spend what it takes to win. We create new institutions, including like Crown enterprises or public enterprises, to get the job done ourselves. We move from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures, because my main critique of almost all of the environmental and climate policies to date is we're trying to incentivize our way to victory, send price signals, encourage, give rebates. It's not going to work. Mm-hmm. And we need to tell the truth. When a government starts to do that and truly engage their public to join them in a grand societal undertaking, you're always going to have a few dissenters, and you're just like we've seen in the pandemic with our antisocial dissenters. But in the main, people are ready to do it. Mm-hmm. In fact, in the main, people are ahead of our politics demanding that they do it. Mm-hmm. Like, well, that's what we think about how people were saying in the pandemic, make things mandatory, make masks mandatory. And the politicians were slow to respond, right? Yeah.
Especially politicians that weren't in states that had significant state capacity or confidence in institutions, like a lot of countries.
They thought that people would rebel.
Right.
By the way, that was true in the war too. Yeah. When they were getting ready to institute rationing at the household level, the thinking in Canada and Britain and elsewhere was that the public would rebel. In fact, those were incredibly popular measures because, first of all, everyone could play their part, and two, they knew it was fair. Yeah. And that's, this is sort of the flip side of your NIMBY point, Chris. I think part of why people actually were largely supportive of mandatory measures in the war, whether masking in the pandemic, and I think they would be with climate, is because in the main, most people want to do the right thing, but it irks them to think that their neighbor won't, because nobody wants to be a chump.
I mean, in terms of things being fair, I have a friend who's a regulatory economist, and we did a show recently on energy democracy, and he was pointing to me a paper to me which was surveying, renewable energy credits and net metering attempts around the world, and 29 of the 37 studies looking at these were actually regressive in terms of resulting in greater income equality, and 7 were neutral. So, I mean, to date, it's not been terribly effective. I wanted to, yeah. I mean, that's a huge challenge, right? As someone who comes from the left, I felt at times like very uncomfortable reading like Hans Rosling's work, and that's sort of this idea. Like he's saying, he does this survey of 20 questions to everybody, right? And it's they're kind of multiple choice, and he does it at Davos. He does it in his public health classes across the board, and he says everybody does worse than if they were just to randomly select letters. If you give a monkey this test, they do better than humans, right? Because we tend to be, and myself included, tend to be very much caught up in a narrative that things are sort of the way they were in the 1950s in terms of a really wealthy world, a really poor world, that there hasn't been progress. And I think as leftists or sometimes anti-capitalists, it's a very uncomfortable truth that, like, if you look at a bunch of objective measures, lifespans are increasing worldwide, child mortality is dropping, there's more vaccinations. And, if capitalism does one thing well, it liberates energy, right? Fossil fuels from the ground, it transforms that into work, which has elevated standards of living. Like, and that is kind of undeniable. And there's this sort of like, fossil fuels or cigarettes thing, which I think is overly simplistic. Like, I'm with you. We've got to make a strong move.
No, they've accomplished amazing things for it.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I guess, in the context of this reindustrialization, I mean, we're not going to be using wind turbines and solar panels to build more wind turbines and solar panels, or to drive those huge mining trucks to get the steel, or power all of these processes. So there's this sort of like subtlety to this that I find challenging. And when energy consumption changes, and there's room, obviously the billionaire class has a lot of room to maneuver here, but when that changes or diminishes or decreases, or when you run into issues of intermittency and reliability of a grid, people suffer from that as a result. So I've been thinking a lot recently about like, for instance, our electricity grid as a commons, right? A friend of mine calls it the network that supports all other networks, right? In terms of healthcare, just the other commons like water distribution, sewage treatment. And, we were talking just before this podcast, like, what if we make some mistakes? And you were saying, well, mistakes are inevitable. But, through this podcast, I've really been looking at a lot of examples, and there's lots of modeling of the future and what things could look like. But when you look at places like California, for instance, there was a recent news story. The grid operators were saying, "Hey, please don't charge your battery electric vehicles right now because the grid's a little short on power." And very much related to large installations of solar, which kind of drop off quickly at night. And and that's also in the context of them shutting down 10% of the state's energy in the form of that Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. So there's like a lot of complexity here. And I'm sorry, this is a huge run-on question, more of a little mini speech here. But like this reindustrialization you're proposing would be done with fossil fuels, and largely, I think there's a real need to examine which technologies, which strategies we employ going forward, so they have the least mining impact and the least energy use.
Of course we do. And this is my point there is, I think that's why we need state level planning. Like, how do you deal with the intermittency? How do you deal with the fact that, different areas are going to have more electricity at various times of day or year or so on? When I said earlier on that looking at this World War II story made me look with fresh eyes at emergency. The remarkable thing about the war is that even though we remained a capitalist economy, and various people made a lot of money, although there was a cap on that. In an emergency, we did not let the private sector or the market decide upon the allocation of scarce resources, because you don't do that in an emergency. And so what did C.D. Howe do? In addition to creating all of these state enterprises, he was carefully coordinating the supply chains of every key input needed for military production, putting controllers in charge of each supply chain. These dollar-a-year men were doing it so that they can be coordinated and prioritized, so that you weren't wasting precious resources on something that wasn't about meeting the emergency, right? And the same happened even when stuff was left in the hands of the private sector. For your American audience, I would remind you, Pearl Harbor happens in December of 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit, and for the next 4 years, their production was basically illegal. Now, that didn't happen because of the goodwill of the automakers or their patriotism. It happened because they were told. And they still made money, and there were still lots of people employed. But when you recognize an emergency, you're focused on how you use your resources, and that's what I'm saying. We're going to need. We're going to need as we meet this moment. I take your earlier point that the fossil fuel era has produced a lot of gains for a lot of people and certain improvements, but what it has not done is, to put this in the parlance of the pandemic, we despite 30 years now of talk on climate and commitments and promises, we have failed to bend the curve. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes, and now it's the 11th hour, and we need to somehow kickstart a different approach.
Yeah. it's interesting thinking of like a transition away from fossil fuels and moving towards a more energy constrained world and the impacts that would have, for instance, on the rapid development of a COVID vaccine or its distribution, through largely airplanes, minus 70-degree freezers, et cetera. I want to shift bases a little bit back to Canada.
By the way, can I say one thing on that, Chris?
Sure.
Because, I give a lot of credit when I say, there was these 4 markers of emergency. I actually give a lot of credit to the Canadian federal government for how they approached the pandemic.
Right.
But this comes back to your earlier point about doing it more ourselves. One thing the Canadian government didn't do at the beginning of the pandemic, unlike some other countries, is recreate, because we used to have one, a public enterprise to mass produce vaccines.
Right.
And in the absence of that, all we could do was import. We were relying on imports from others. Worse than that, we used our economic muscle to outbid poorer countries, which is the opposite of what we did in the war with those crown enterprises. We were the arsenal for our allies.
Right.
And I think we need to approach it that way again.
Yeah. So pivoting back to Canada, because, in your book, I was noticing, you have a long section on like the what ifs. We could do this, we could do that. I think you're drawing largely on Mark Z. Jacobson's roadmaps, maybe a few other studies. Yeah. And I mean, it's common in the energy democracy literature as well. Cori Bush's House resolution in the States recently. It's very, 100% renewables is the way that we're going. In the context of Canada, where we have, decarbonized electricity grids in our hydro-endowed provinces like Manitoba, BC, Quebec, Labrador, those they have a lot more to decarbonize, but they've done electricity in a hydro-constrained setting. Like our other provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, they're still quite coal and gas heavy. Ontario does really stand out, and this is a province that's 65%. Like that's where I'm coming from here, 65% nuclear-powered province, and it's really kind of the only. Again, the only location without copious hydro that's been able to pull that off. As a leftist, I've been sort of re-interrogating my thoughts on nuclear energy, and it is interesting. It's it's about 70,000 workers work in the industry, most very high union penetration, like perhaps a model for a just transition. Mining that occurs in a very small footprint. If we're talking about all the mines we have to open up, like these are all questions of Indigenous sovereignty, regardless of what we're mining, but. I was talking to a uranium mining expert, and he was saying that 1% of global primary energy comes out of the Athabascan uranium deposits, out of like 4 mines. 1% of all the energy that humans use, and Canada indeed exports this fuel to fuel carbon-free sources around the world, right? In the U.S. and Europe. So in a way, we're kind of.
What about the nukes?
What's that? Yeah. What about the nukes? I know you have a history sort of in the peace movement and anti-nuclear war stuff.
Actually, nuclear energy was where I first started. So like you, I've had to interrogate my thoughts on that. And here's where I've landed. And actually, because I'm like your weird uncle and everything comes back to the war for me. I borrow a line from the war. In the war, we had this conscription referendum. And the famous line was conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. Right. That's basically how I feel about nuclear. Nuclear if necessary, but not necessarily nuclear. Right. What do I mean by that? For those jurisdictions, particularly yours in Ontario, that rely quite heavily at the moment on nuclear, I certainly do not advocate decommissioning what's there. Not right now. I mean, we need it. And we needed that firm energy to back up the move to renewables. But on the question of new nuclear to meet what's necessary, I am not at all sold that it is a fruitful path forward. And part of why I say that is because if there's a theme running through what I've been talking about here with you, it's speed and scale. Nuclear is so expensive and its regulatory approval so lengthy, it's almost anathema to speed and scale. And hearkening back to your earlier question about NIMBYism and so on, if you think about a community and you ask them what are you willing to entertain in your backyard, a nuclear plant or a solar field or a wind farm, your answer to that question probably tells you as much as you need to know about which of those technologies is going to lend itself to speed and scale, particularly the speed part. But I do think, the first part of your question is one we're wrestling with. What about those jurisdictions, the flat jurisdictions in particular, that don't have the hydro? How are they going to get their firm backup power and so on? I think, I'm not an engineer, but I think there is a combination of, first of all, so many of these renewables operate in a complementary fashion to back each other up. Secondly, this is why we need state level planning. We need to share more electricity from province to province. And third, I find much more hope in battery technology and where it's going and the speed and scale of what it can accomplish than I do in the nuclear option, which isn't. Look, if someone can successfully pull it off real quick, I'm not going to oppose that.
I guess, I don't want to get into a big debate with you, but I think the question is, what if someone has, and in the setting of France in 12 to 15 years, they decarbonized their electricity, 75% of it is nuclear powered. They have emissions that are 1/10 that of Germany, and they did that in 12 to 15 years. So we know it is conceivable, and we're talking about World War II level mobilizations and what's possible. Again, and this was under a very technocratic government post-war, very state-led and state-directed. But I mean, that's the issue that I have when I look at this.
It's possible.
Yeah, it's possible.
And I mean, and our hydro happened in the war.
What's that? Yeah,
Quebec, a huge amount of our hydro. Sure. Not just Quebec.
But hydro is constrained, right? And for me, I look at the modeling, I look at a variety of studies, but I like to see kind of what's on evidence now, right? Because we were saying before, we can't screw this up. Right. If we choose the wrong suite of technologies that aren't in the end able to deliver decarbonization, we're in real trouble. So I think it really is incumbent upon people that are wrestling with this to sort of red team it, right? And
so that's why I say I don't want to discourage it. I don't want to discourage it, and that's why I say nuclear if necessary, but not necessarily nuclear. Right. Let's pursue it. My caution is, I hear an awful lot of people who latch on to certain things like hydrogen or nuclear or carbon capture as a kind of get out of jail free card. Their hope is that if we could just make that thing work, then we won't have to do all this other heavy lifting of decarbonizing our economy. And my concern is the flip side of yours. What if we roll the dice on that and they're wrong?
Well, I mean, I mean, again, one can look at Germany where they've spent 500 billion euros on a very wind and solar heavy attempt at decarbonization. Their emissions have gone down from around 400 or 500 to 250. But they have not retired their firm fleet, right? They had about 90.
I'm not saying we should.
No, absolutely. They had 90 gigawatts of sort of fossil and nuclear, and they built 110 gigawatts of wind and solar. They're retiring nuclear, replacing it with coal, which we both agree on is a very bad idea. But because of the intermittency question, they're not able to get rid of that 90 gigawatts, and they're actually building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and keeping coal online. And I think there's a tendency amongst environmentalists to say, well, just shut down the goddamn coal. You're not trying hard enough. And there's, the kind of Einsteinian saying of, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and not getting different results. I mean, we're seeing a similar thing in California where we're not able to eliminate that underpinning fossil infrastructure when you go to a weather-dependent resource. And when you have decarbonization examples, like real-world decarbonization examples, like Ontario's achievement with its grid and kicking coal off the grid, which was 90% nuclear powered, these are concrete examples that have worked so far. So I tend to trust the on-the-ground evidence that I'm seeing rather than a lot of the, there's a real faith, I think, as you described in technofixes, it's equal amongst the wind solar battery crowd. And I just think we need to really red team it and make sure that we're not kind of basing a strategy on, a few papers. That's been my thing is I need to spend a couple of years before I can really, form a strong opinion on this. And I have, I think it's becoming kind of obvious that I have an opinion that I think nuclear is a really essential part of decarbonization in terms of what it's achieved so far. It faces a lot of current struggles, but yeah, I mean, and again, I don't want to ambush you in this interview by having a nuclear versus anti-nuclear discussion. I don't think it's as simple as that.
It's a good discussion. It's important, but here's what. You probably know more about Ontario than I do. I'm in British Columbia, but my understanding in Ontario is that first of all, Ontario achieved something significant in getting coal off the grid. It resulted in North America's largest drop in emissions.
Yeah.
Nuclear played an important role in allowing that to happen, but the infrastructure was there.
Yes.
And there were no new nuclear plants built. There was increased capacity granted at existing plants. And so that allowed for some of that to happen. So I'm trying to remain open-minded about this. I think our approach has to be staged. So what does that mean? It means you don't invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure, right? You don't get out of a hole by continuing to dig. The existing fossil fuels capacity has to be wound down. It doesn't mean it has to be stopped tomorrow. It means it has to be put on a 2-decade path to be phased out and replaced. That's a decent amount of time. And then I think you're quite right by saying, look, we're going to have to spend a lot of money, and we want to get the best bang for our buck, the most effective bang for our buck. And if someone can show me the evidence that we would get more bang for the buck going nuclear than renewables, I'm open to seeing it. But most of what I've seen to date is that the cost comparisons are not in nuclear's favor. But I'm open. Show me something that I'm wrong on that.
Yeah. I mean, the Jacobson paper that is heavily referenced by a lot of the climate movement. It's really interesting. I was actually talking with Dimitri Lascaris about this the other day, who's a very renowned lawyer and leftist, and we were having the similar discussion about nuclear, and he based a lot of his federal leadership campaign off of Mark Z. Jacobson's work. And there was a really important rebuttal paper that was published that showed some very major issues with Jacobson's work, which one of the name ones that came to my mind was he was relying on a lot of hydro to back up the weather dependent grid. And it didn't involve building new hydro, but just putting a lot of new turbines and dams, which would result in 100-year floods on a daily basis and, large river basins. So this was pointed out to him by Christopher Clack et al., about 20 academics in a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. And, Jacobson was offered a chance to reply in the journal, but instead he launched a class action lawsuit, a SLAP lawsuit against the journal and against Christopher Clack et al., fellow scientists. And it was just really chilling. So, I mean, and, when I told Dimitri that, I didn't actually understand it as a SLAP. He was like, that's a SLAP lawsuit. He was really, really shocked, and it kind of shook him. So maybe I'll be your kind of red team, and we don't need to go into that further, but I think these are very interesting questions. Are you aware of the work of Václav Smil at all?
I haven't read it. I see it referenced a bit, but I have not read him myself.
He's a fascinating guy, and he's written a great book on energy transitions historically. But I think it just illustrates the daunting task ahead. For instance, it took the U.S. 25 years to increase its share of oil from 5 to 25%. And they've gotten much higher now. But, even with a fuel that is so favorable and abundant and easy to use and transform, it took a long time. And I think that's my concern, is that we're moving from a source of energy which is harming the atmosphere and going to lead to calamity down the road, but we're leading into forms of energy. And even I would include nuclear in that as well. It's very energy dense. It moves up the energy density ladder, but it's hard to operate. And I think there's going to be all kinds of social contradictions that come out of the consequences of using less energy, which is, something that's very favored by the environmental movement, but has a lot of unintended consequences in terms of a lot of the things that we take for granted in the West.
Right. And nothing has no environmental cost.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't solve all of those debates. What I am is a political scientist and an interloper historian now with this book.
Yeah.
And mainly what I'm trying to argue is, first of all, there's this interesting historic example here that when you truly get into emergency mode, we can surprise ourselves by the speed and scope of how quickly we can transform things. It sort of stands out as unusual, but oddly, in terms of the timing of the book, the pandemic has once again given us not the same level of that, but an insight of how quickly we're capable of moving. And in the Canadian example, like we talk about the fact that any way you cut it, whichever technology, we're going to have to spend a lot of money.
Yeah.
So in this pandemic, after years of being told, there was not enough money to tackle homelessness or poverty or the climate emergency, suddenly the Bank of Canada, our public, our public central bank, was buying up federal government securities to the tune of $5 billion a week for a year.
Right.
In contrast, our federal government, the Trudeau government, spends on climate action $5 billion a year.
Right.
So $5 billion a week for the pandemic emergency response,
right.
$5 billion a year for climate. So something's happened to liberate our sense of what's possible if and when a government actually recognizes an emergency for what it is. As far as figuring out the details of, which exact path to take in order to decarbonize and electrify everything, I'm happy to defer to the people with a lot more expertise than me. I'm simply trying to say remarkable things are possible when we recognize an emergency.
Yeah, I think that's the core message of the book and what made it so interesting to me. Seth, where can my listeners find your work? Where can they buy your book?
Well, the book's pretty widely available. Again, lots of sales through independent bookstores, but you can buy it online. You can just find options through my website, which is just sethklein.ca.
Yeah.
As you mentioned off the top, I'm now trying to spend the next few years animating and mobilizing the emergency ideas in the book with this new little outfit called the Climate Emergency Unit. So people can find that at climateemergencyunit.ca.
Right.
The technology questions aside that we've spent the last half of this discussing, this is a political moment. It's a moment to make super clear to anyone contesting for leadership that we expect them to meet this moment with us in emergency scale. That's what we're going to be having to communicate to all of our candidates. We're going to be having to back true climate champions. And if we can't find them, we're going to have to be them.
All right, Seth. Well, on that note, thank you for making the time. It's been a pleasure to have you on Decouple.